Hi, I'm Karma Brown, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Karma Brown.
He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl, well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe. Listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together, and this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle, available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. As always, stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from our good friend Richard Gleaves. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm excited to have Karma Brown on the show with me. Today, she has a brand new book that's out just yesterday when you're hearing this. So it's called The Life Lucy Knew, and this is a fascinating book. Karma, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
First memory of wanting to be a writer. Well, the truth is I actually never wanted to be a writer, despite the fact that I did write books when I was young, and my mom had them bound for me, which is a really special gift. But I wrote a book about these two ice skating elephants who fell in love. I think that was probably around grade 4, and I illustrated it myself. But I never imagined a career as a writer, and I went to journalism school. And that was a post-grad degree I did, and I wanted to be a news anchor. That was my goal. And people would say, well, you're in journalism school. You want to be a writer. I would say, no, I don't want to be a writer. I never want to do that. So I'm not sure actually how I ended up here. I became a print journalist, and I did a lot of magazine work, and I was a freelancer for a number of years. And then just one day I thought, well, how hard can it be to write a novel compared to a 2,000-word journalistic piece? Let's just see. And that's how it began for me. And I love it now. I didn't think of it as a career, and I never had this ambition to do that, but it is something I absolutely love doing now.
So you're thinking, okay, I can do a 2,000-word piece. I just need to do that 50 times and stitch it all together.
Yes,
right.
How hard can that be, Hank? Really, it's just how hard can it be? It's
right.
hard, as it turns out.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I make a little bit of a differentiation between being a writer or storyteller and being someone that actively pursues publishing. I think that you can. I think it's perfectly fine if it's your life's ambition to just tell stories for yourself, or maybe collect things for your family, or whatever. Taking that extra step to publishing is a whole different thing, and I think that people are either born with that ability or not, and then if they choose to take that anywhere, that's a whole other thing. But after the books that you wrote and your mother bound for you. did you continue to do stuff like that through school, just with no ambition to pursue it professionally? Was storytelling something that stayed with you?
It really just wasn't something I did. I kept a diary as a teenager because this is what you were supposed to do. And, even writing diary entries, I was just bored and I didn't want to do it, but then I would do it because everybody was doing it. And so it just wasn't, for whatever reason, it wasn't on my radar. I didn't write creatively just for fun. I wasn't, a frustrated poet writing my poems on napkins in coffee shops.
Right.
That just wasn't who I was. I was a storyteller in the sense that with the journalism piece, I loved the idea of telling other people's stories. And I think that as a reader, I'm a lifelong, voracious reader. And so I think for me, that is the piece that has probably been constant and been consistent. I'm still like that. And that probably has inspired me as a writer, just more than anything else, more than any ambition I had. I think being a reader, suddenly it occurred to me that was a job that people have and could do. You could be an author. And, I've been reading since I was really, really young. So maybe that for me is the link. People always assume that I have wanted to be a writer from the time that I could remember wanting to be anything. And I wanted to be a singer. I have a terrible singing voice, so that was never going to happen. But yeah, being a writer came to me later, just later in life.
So what brought you to journalism?
Well, as a teenager, I wanted to be a news anchor, and there was a particular news anchor who was local to me. I'm here in Canada, and her name was Thalia Harris, and I thought she was amazing. And I remember watching her on the nightly news and thinking she has such a breadth of knowledge about the world and what's going on, and she sits there so confidently every night and tells everybody else what's happening. And I thought just the ability to have so much knowledge about so many different things was fascinating, because I've always been curious. So that really felt like a good match to me. And that goal stayed with me. And so when I finally did go to journalism school, that was the ambition I had. But then I finished journalism school. My plan was to go on to be a news anchor. That was where I was headed. And then I was diagnosed with cancer. And I was 30. The last day of my journalism degree, I was diagnosed. And that really changed everything for me. And I reevaluated what I wanted to do. And it took me a couple of years after that to come to the place where I thought, maybe I'll start working in magazine, and then maybe I'll do some writing. And I realized I loved it. But, it was a very big life change event that sort of led me from journalism then to writing novels.
Isn't it amazing, those life-changing events, those awakenings, if you will, have the ability to shake you somewhat, and the things that are tertiary or maybe are not your true passion, those things just have a tendency to fall away. Yes. Yeah,
it does certainly put things into perspective.
Yeah.
And you realize you have to take a good long look at what actually is important to you and do some thinking on that. So yeah, that's where I ended up just doing a 180. And then suddenly I was a writer. And people were like, yes, we always knew it. I was like, well, it's a surprise to me, but there you go.
So it was evident to everyone but you.
Yes, I suppose. That's probably true. Yes.
So what sorts of books really grabbed your attention? You said that really being a lover of books is what kind of let you know that this was something that you want to do. What sorts of things do you have a tendency to just fall into and get lost in?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I find that now as an author, it's hard to read a book without my author goggles on. And,
right.
And I know that's a common thing amongst people who write, because you're always looking at style and structure and have an appreciation for how a book is is put together and how it's characterized. And so if I find a story or I find an author who can pull me out of that and I can just enjoy it as a reader without doing that analysis as I'm going through, then those are the types of books I really fall into. And probably the author who does that for me the most is Lauren Groff. And she's a fairly new author to me. She wrote Fates and Furies, and I hadn't read anything by her until I read Fates and Furies. But that book just sucked me right in, and I completely forgot that I was a writer, and I was so enamored by the story. So, you know, I do look for books like that can give me that escapism, both from the world and also from, you know, my own author brain. So,
speaking of those author goggles, you know, it does get very difficult to just read for pleasure and to get lost in someone else's world, because you're picking apart the plot structure and you're thinking, oh, this characterization is really great. You know, and judging whether something works or not. And then it gets very difficult to watch movies with other people, because, you know, you find yourself screaming,
yes,
well, there's the end of Act 2, you know? Yes,
exactly. It drives my husband crazy.
Right. That's a really weak inciting incident. You know?
Yeah. Yes. That's so true.
Do you find any things that help to shift gears between a consumer of things and a writer that's studying things, or is it just nearly impossible now to separate the two?
I think it is. I have not figured out how to do it consistently. I think that it comes down to the book and the author. And Meg Wolitzer is another one who does that for me. I can just read her books for pleasure without really I mean, I'm always in awe of what she's done, but I don't spend a lot of my time thinking about it as I'm reading. So, and you know, it's like anything. I mean, reading is so subjective, and the love of a book is so subjective. And I have read books that I've hated that other people have loved, and books I've loved other people have hated. So sometimes it's just finding that quiet moment where you don't have anything pressing, you don't have a deadline, you're not thinking about a plot problem in your own book, and you can just sit and relax and read and enjoy it for the sake of just doing that and that alone.
Your debut novel, Come Away With Me, was that the first novel that you decided to write when you had this novelist awakening, or did you pursue something else first?
No, that was not my first book. I actually had written 2 before it. They were my practice books, as I like to call them. And the very first one I wrote, I knew it was not great as I was writing it. And I loved the premise, and it was my first crack into trying to write a novel, which I went into quite naively thinking that I could do it because I knew how to tell a story. And it's a difference between 2,000 and 90,000 words, and you know, you just figure out what goes on in that muddy middle, and then you're good, right? Beginning, middle, and end. And so I did use that first book, though, as a way to learn about the process of being an author, of getting an agent, of writing a query letter, of learning how to distill your entire plot down into an elevator pitch. So it was an exercise in education for me, with this career that I was attempting to see if I could make happen. And, you know, in the beginning, I really only had a goal of getting a book published. It wasn't like I imagined 10 books. I just was really focused on that first one. So I used it as my practice book, and I didn't get an agent, but I did get a lot of insight about what I needed to do. And so at the time, I have a mantra that it's always be writing. And I'm always saying this to myself and to other people who ask about being an author and how to write a book. It's like, well, just always be writing, because you never know which book is going to be the one that's going to get you that next step that you're looking for. And so I was already working on another story, and I finished it, and I put in all the things I'd learned from my first practice book, and I got my agent with that book. But then we didn't sell that book, because, of course, once you get the agent, which feels like finding a unicorn, and then you have your agent, and they're going to take it out to the publishing houses, because they are the gateway between you and the editors who want to buy that book and then publish it. And that book didn't sell. But because I'm always writing, I had another book in the works that was ready to go, which was Come Away With Me. And that one ended up selling. So, it was my debut, but it was not my first novel.
Well, you can take classes on novel writing. You can, attend seminars. You can do everything in the world to become a novelist. And the only way to actually become a novelist is to sit down and write a novel and to keep doing it until you eventually get good at it. And I like to say that there are really only two necessary tools in a writer's toolbox. And the first one is to read a lot. You need to understand how books work and how language works. And you get that by reading a lot and paying attention to what you read. And then the other major tool is writing. And you just have to sit down and do the work. And you eventually get better at it, but those failed attempts are just as educational and just as formative as the one that breaks out. Absolutely.
I mean, my debut would not have been the book it was if I didn't have those other two books ahead of it. And I agree with you that you should read a lot and read everything.
Yes.
Not just read in one genre or one author. You really need to expand and just see how people are using language differently and storytelling and their structures. And so there's a whole piece about preparing yourself to do this. I took online classes. I did an in-person class. I had my journalism training, which helped me a lot. I also think that being just very disciplined is a big part of it as well. There's so much failure, and people are telling you no all the time. Even after you have books published, people still continue to tell you no all the time. And so being disciplined about taking that criticism and taking that failure and then being able to just get up the next day and sit down, put your butt in the seat, and write the words that you need to get done that day, that's really what propels you forward. And if that's probably more important, learning how to do that than, learning how to write an excellent query. You need to do that too, but you need to learn to just get the words down. I have a lot of people who talk about writer's block, and I personally don't believe in writer's block. I don't think it's a thing. I think it's a great thing to use as a procrastination strategy. Like, my muse has not come to me, so now I am blocked and therefore I cannot write today. But I think that you just need to sit down, and if you may only get 100 words, and they may never last in their final version of your book, but it is part of the habit. There's a habit to it that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What do you think you learned that was crucial in those first couple of books? Let me ask you this. On the third book, did you feel that this one was different, or did you feel the same as you did on the others? And if you did, if you knew that there was something, maybe you had evolved, maybe the premise was better, maybe, whatever the magic thing was. And how did you execute that thing that was different?
I think that it certainly was different. I think the premise was stronger, and so then it was easier to write because I had a clear vision for what the story needed to be. But I also had learned a lot, particularly about characterization, dialogue. My books are all very voice and character driven, and so having solid characters who feel like real people on the page is really important, because the plot is important. It matters, and there needs to be tension, and the pacing of the story needs to feel good when people are reading it. But if the characters don't feel real and they don't feel like people that you want to sit down and have a conversation with and you can really get to know over the course of a novel, then it just never really finds its legs, in my opinion anyway, with books. And so when I sat down to write my first book, again, I thought I had this all figured out, and as a journalist, I had done a lot of interviews and writing, and I thought I can do this. And so I sat down and I started writing the first couple of pages, and then I got to a dialogue section where the characters had to talk to one another. And all of a sudden I realized, like, I had no idea how to write dialogue. I could take someone's something that someone had said, a source had said, and I could put it into a story in a magazine article. But then it suddenly came to these characters having conversation, and it just wasn't working. I didn't know how to do it. So I went and I read Stephen King's On Writing, which is sort of my Bible for writing, and I go back to it often. And I read through that whole book, and he talked about dialogue, and I really learned how to write dialogue from Stephen King in that book. And so that was a big piece for me. I learned a trick that I don't think anyone taught me. I just decided that I would do this, where I speak out the dialogue before I write it down, which is a bit awkward when you're writing in Starbucks and you're trying to have a conversation between your characters, and you have to do it at the table, quietly, whispering if you can. But I find that helps make the dialogue really authentic. And so with the book, with my debut, I had just learned enough, I think, that I didn't mean that I still didn't have lots of edits to do when I got to working with my editor, but I feel like I had a better handle on what it means to write a story, to craft those different parts of a story, those different scenes, and to have it be a satisfying read at the end.
Dialogue is one of those weird things that is a hybrid of good writing and real life.
Yes.
If you record people's conversations verbatim, there are lots of broken sentences, half said words, lots of starts and stops, and when you write that, it looks really clunky. But if you write it properly, it's very clinical. And dialogue is somewhere between those two. And
it is.
And the only way to, like we said earlier, the only way to do it right is to keep practicing at it. And I love what you said about speaking your dialogue out before you write it. I usually do that in my editing. Read it out loud to see if it sounds authentic, or this character would never say it like that. That there's just something about vocalizing that helps to keep it true.
It does. And, I get actually a lot of compliments about my dialogue, which I always then turn around and tell people, I had no idea how to do it, so thank you. I was terrible at dialogue. But I also, it's the little nuances.
Yeah.
Like sometimes I'll read a book and people are putting in, as if you and I were having a conversation, and it's just the two of us, and every time I'm speaking to you, I use your name.
Right.
Hank, it's so interesting that you asked me that. And I see that so often in books, and in books that, where I feel like people should know better than to do that, because that's not how we speak. We don't, if I'm just sitting down having a conversation with you, I'm not using your name every time we are exchanging words. So it's those little tiny things that you pick up on and then you try to, cut out so that, as you said, it feels very authentic.
Well, and one litmus test that I like to use is if I have a conversation in dialogue, and I don't use any dialogue tags, no he said, she said, and just the straight lines of dialogue, can I tell which character is speaking?
Yes.
And now when you've got 3 or 4 people speaking, you need some dialogue tags occasionally. But if there are 2 people speaking, I should be able to follow it and know who it is by the way you have built your character already.
Exactly.
Right. And so dialogue also comes out of how you have built believable characters early in the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Agree.
So that first book, Come Away With Me, was a Globe and Mail Best 100 book of 2015. Then your next 2 books, The Choices We Make and In This Moment, both were on the Toronto Star bestseller list. So now we're up to your 4th book, The Life Lucy Knew. The premise of this book is absolutely amazing. Tell me how this story came about.
Well, I was actually in the midst of writing an entirely different story, and I was about 20,000 words in, and I have been on a book a year schedule, which is pretty tight, and it means that I'm writing a first draft in about 4 months. because the book has to be ready a year ahead of publication. And so I was 20,000 words into this other story, and it didn't have legs. I thought it would have legs. My editor thought it would, but then as I got into it, there was just nothing there. And so panic ensued. But, when you're on deadline, you need to just shift your focus and figure out what you're going to do. And so someone had tweeted at me this link to an article about a man who had this very unique memory issue. And it was in the Boston Globe, and this man lived in the UK. And they had tweeted it at me and said, this sounds like a Karma Brown book. And so I, of course, because I was procrastinating, because I was in the midst of a terrible book that I was trying to write, I clicked through and I read the story, and it just stuck with me. And I instantly thought, well, what if that happened to me? What would I do? And so what the condition is that this man he had been in an accident, in a bike accident, and ended up in a coma. And when he came out of the coma, he had some memory loss for the things that had happened in his life up to that point. But he also had this very strange condition, which is a real condition. It's rare, where it's called false memory syndrome. And he had memories of things that had actually never happened to him. And as I did my research, I learned that our brains don't like blank spaces. And so if we find ourselves in a situation like we're in a coma, where the brain is needing to be quiet and the body's quiet, the brain doesn't like having these blank spaces because you're not forming new memories when you're in the coma. And so what it does to fill that time is to take bits and pieces from your memory. And it could be a real life memory that then gets stitched together with something you read or a movie you watched. And so suddenly it forms into this memory, which to that person will feel very true, and just like every other memory they have in their life, but is in fact false. And I just thought, well, what if this happened to me, and everything that I know and I believe and I'm hoping for is suddenly turned on its head? And that's where the character Lucy came out of. And she just came to me very clearly. And I said to my editor, I need to shift gears. I'm going to write this book. And she said, go for it. And I did. And that's how it started.
I want to take a pause from the show for just a moment to tell you about a sponsor. As a writer, your editor is often the first and last eyes on your work. The best editors are trusted collaborators, bringing your story to life in a way you didn't know was possible. Marlo Moss will take your writing to a new level and your career to new heights, ensuring that readers not only buy your book, but also love reading it too. One top editor calls Marlo Moss a talented author in his own right and as skilled an editor as I've seen. I use his skills myself. One of his authors says, I had no idea my writing could be this good. Tension, POV, or timeline issues, plot and pacing, Marlo does it all, and for the price of a copy edit. Your hard work deserves a better editor, and Marlo Moss is the editing partner you've been looking for at a price you can afford. Offering developmental and copy editing as well as beta and proofreaders, visit marlomoss.net for more information and a free sample edit. That's MarloWMoss.net. And let me tell you, I have used Marlo Moss. He has edited a story for me, and the comments that I got back were eye-opening. You know, as a writer and as someone who spends time with words as much as I do, you tend to gloss over things. You just completely lose them because you're so involved in creating, and you need to step away and let someone else put their eyes on it and help you see the things that you can't see for yourself. Marlo Moss is amazing. MarloWMoss.net. Wow. So you've got the character of Lucy, awakens in the hospital, and she's married to a man, but believes that she's married to someone else.
Well, she's not married, but she has a boyfriend.
Right.
But she believes that she's married to her ex and has no memory of the man who is currently her boyfriend. She knows him. He's a work colleague, but she has no memory of their romantic relationship. They live together. She has no memory of that. So she wakes believing that she has married this other man.
This is literally a nightmare scenario for everyone involved.
It is. It is. And this is why you've got to make it bad, right? When you're writing a book, in order for there to be tension and bad things need to happen. So, yes, it is a nightmare for all of them. Yes.
Man. When you're dealing with mental illness, that can be a very tricky subject to write about, and has to be handled with, not with kid gloves, because we do need to write about it honestly. But how do you handle the situation respectfully while portraying what it's really like? Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, it does. I think, and I didn't really approach this as a mental illness for Lucy. It's certainly a mental condition that she has, and she does struggle to some degree with some depressive feelings based on what's going on in her life, and the challenges that she's facing. I do think it's important to talk about it. I do think that it is tricky because everyone has such a unique experience with it. And one person with anxiety will have a completely different experience of it from another person suffering from anxiety. And so I often will go back to my own experiences from when I was going through cancer. And, while that was happening, and people would say, well, this is the worst possible thing that could have ever happened to you. And that's true. At that time in my life in particular, that was very true. But I also had, a fantastic summer while I was doing chemo, and I had a new boyfriend, and we went to weddings and cottages, and we had lots of laughs. And so it's so complicated because you can still have joy even while you're having great sorrow. And with writing Lucy, I drew on my own experiences around that she was strong and she was determined to figure it out and to have the best life that she could. And she wasn't sure exactly what that looked like, but she was determined that she was going to figure it out. And so I came at it more from that place. I mean, hopefully that's what readers get from her as they're reading, that she's strong, she makes mistakes, she is flawed, but she is strongly committed to making a choice for her future. And so she's in control. And she does work with a therapist because it's very confusing for her trying to manage these, because all these false memories also have attached to them very strong emotions. And that is complicated for her because then there's other people who have strong emotions for her, and she's trying to balance it all and trying to make everybody happy. And so at some point she has to just decide that she's going to choose to make herself happy, and she's going to figure out how to do that.
You talked earlier about reading widely in different genres and different types of stories, and it really shows in a book like this because this book is very hard for me to categorize if I were going to put this on a shelf, and which I absolutely love, because I think most books that really resonate deeply are hard to categorize because life is multi-genre. There's a bit of romance, and there's a bit of tragedy, and there's a bit of silly joy, and life is all those things wrapped up. And genre designations are for bookstores, not necessarily for writers. How do you categorize a story like this?
And this is a tricky one, right? I mean, the
yes.
book, and it's a hard conversation to figure out how to have, because my book will be categorized as women's fiction in some settings, which implies that only women can read it and appreciate the story, which I think is false. It is a woman who's the protagonist, but that doesn't mean that men can't read the story and also have it resonate with them, right?
Right.
So I always just say that it is fiction, and that it is, there will be emotional parts to the story, and it feels like something that could happen in real life. And so I just call it fiction so that I don't get into that place where I'm trying to find a label for it that makes sense for everyone, because that is a hard thing as a female author who writes books that are about a woman's journey, but can be applicable to anybody, to not feel like you get pigeonholed into a certain genre or category.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's true for men authors as well. If you write a story that doesn't have very definite genre tropes, people don't know what to do with it, and you start querying agents and they say, well, what kind of book is it? And you're like, well, let me tell you. And, you've lost the agent there, Well,
and you do have to be able to, tell an agent and where that book is going to sit on the shelf. What other books will it sit beside?
Right.
Because that is the only way to get a book sold.
Yeah.
Books do not typically get sold to editors when nobody can figure out where they're going to go, unless it's, the most dynamic thing they've read in the last 20 years and they absolutely have to publish it. But people like to have categories. And so you need to be able to show that you understand that this could fit in with other books that are similar. It's just that when it then goes to get marketed and people start talking about it and sharing the story, you hope that it can reach a wider audience. You hope that some of those labels don't stifle it.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? It's a tricky thing. It is a tricky thing.
It is. Well, this is a fantastic book, Karma.
Thank you.
Like I said, the premise from when I first got the book in the mail and I read the jacket, I was like, oh, this is going to be really interesting. And then from the first page, you just really grab the reader. The book is out now. We're going to encourage everyone to go pick up a copy of it. What are you working on now? What's coming up next?
Well, right now I am on a small break, which has been a nice change because I've been so busy and I'm always either promoting or writing or drafting or revising. So it is nice to have a few months to just do some reading and relax a little bit. I am
writer and break are words that don't normally go together.
Well, they don't, and it's hard. It's hard to force yourself to take a break. And then there's the fear that if you take a break, when you go back to starting the next draft, which I do have to do very soon, that you will forget how to do it. I mean, I think I've forgotten how to write a book every time I go back to start a new book.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that is a very common thing. But having a little time and a little space to just read without it being reading for comparative titles or, to just read for pleasure has been such a nice thing.
Well, and writers need to remember that, if you're going to report on the world and the state of human affairs, you need to get out and meet a few humans every now and then and see what the world is like. And as writers, we tend to kind of hole up by ourselves and tell these stories, and you need to go refill the well every now and then. You
absolutely do. That is a very good point.
Karma, it's been a lot of fun talking today. The new book, like we said, The Life Lucy Knew, is out and available everywhere now. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you. It was really great chatting with you today.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I was walking through the woods between Wolfert's Roost and the future site of my father's Stone Manor house. The house would eventually stand on what had been old Baltus's pumpkin field, the land where I had found my grandfather's head. Father had chosen the spot for its view of the Hudson River. Knoll was to be a grand mansion in the Gothic Revival style, but at the time the mansion was but a few foundations of Van Brunt stone. I had become fond of the place already, the idea of it, and I spent many a night alone in a shack on the property. My mother disapproved. She would have me sleep in the room across from hers in our townhouse. But I was 15 and did not answer to her. I kept a bottle of spirits hidden in the crook of 2 walnut trees near old Baltus's grave. I thought he would approve of the gesture. I had stopped along my way to fetch it out. At the moment the first pull of liquor touched my throat, I heard a ghastly, inhuman laugh. I was not alone in the woods. Had God sent the horseman after me? Had I sinned that terribly? I ran through the wood and found the field where Noel was to be built. The outline of the foundations was barely discernible beneath the snow. An apparition stood there. Though I have seen him many times since, I shall never forget my first glimpse. Gaunt in moonlight, headless, exuding power and malice. A magic thing in the land of the ordinary. The Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. What chills those words evoke. It charged at me, hatchet raised. I stood transfixed, unable to move, unable to even imagine escape. This was the servant of God, after all, sent to strike down sinners. I hurled the bottle from my hand, ashamed that I had become a drunkard as Baltus had been. It shattered against the foundations of Noel. I stretched out my arms and awaited judgment. A piercing white light broke the darkness. The horse reared. "Not my Dylan!" cried Agatha, appearing from the wood. She held a skull in her hand. It shone brightly as a diamond. And in that moment I understood. The horseman did not serve God. He served my grandmother. Perhaps in that moment I came to see Agatha and God as one and the same. The unholy spirit fought her command. A foreleg of the demon horse struck my head with such power that I fell backwards with a cry and knew no more. I carry the scar to this day. A slight indentation in my temple, barely noticeable. In my days of courting I was told that when I am angry the patch of insulted skull bone will stand out in a disturbing manner. I have never had occasion to see this phenomenon, however, as I am generally well pleased whenever I pass a mirror.